Hello, and welcome back to Human Geography. So today I want to talk a little bit about social behavior, kinship. So we're talking about families, tribes, clans. These are the roots of what we see in modern society today. And so the really big question that we want to ask first is why are we social to begin with? What do we get out of that? Well, I mean, you can definitely see group living, and you can see that in any kind of animal. So, first of all, you would be more productive with food acquisition, right? Because you have more hands. Now, on the downside, you also have to deal with the fact that you have more mouths in addition to more hands. However, you can still be more efficient and more successful because it does allow for specialization too. I mean, you may have someone who specializes in particular herbs and recognizes those and is just collecting that, and or someone is a good hunter, and so they are the one who's going to get more, and you don't have to get everything yourself. It's nice. Also, protection from predation. You also have protection from other groups, so it's not just predation, but you could see how you could start that way, right? And we actually do not, sociality does not originate with humans. If you look at primate groups, almost all of them are social, like large group social. Okay. Now, the other thing that's really important for humans, at least, is that we have this great increased survival chance of our offspring, right? When you have cooperative child rearing, you have many eyes, you have many hands, and so you have these little helpless things that require lots and lots of care, and you don't have to do it by yourself. Okay. This is more likely to occur with related individuals. When you are sharing genes and you ensure that children who share some of your genes survive, whether it's actually your child or not, that is going to be increasing your fitness because your genes are indirectly passed on. And so you're more likely to make sacrifices and put the investment into someone who has a biological bond with you, and that is genetics, of course. So when we talk about kinship, what is it going to refer to? Kinship refers to those relationships found in all societies that are based on blood, include consanguineal relatives, that's a fun word, include affinal relatives or affinal relatives, all of these or none of these. Well, you should probably ask yourself at this point, if you don't already know, what those two new, probably, words mean. Consanguineal and affinal. Consanguineal, sanguine, refers to blood. So A and B are actually saying the same thing, right? And then affinal are going to be, these are going to be people that you affiliate with, that you will ally yourself with in a close bond. And so kinship does not necessarily have to mean that you are blood related, although the majority of the time you probably do share that. Okay, so when we talk about kinship, we're talking about a social network of relatives, right? In this group, individuals have rights that are provided to them by the group, and in return, there are obligations that they must fulfill, these duties to the group, okay? And your status, your kinship status, will determine what these rights and obligations are, okay? And really, when you start talking about this family group, this is the predominant structure in societies that are not political states. So what we're really talking about here is a tribal type system. And it's especially going to be true for foraging, crop cultivating, and pastoral societies, okay? And so we're talking about more or less industrialized, really. And here, I like these two pictures because you can see that both of these families use red as their identifying color. They're all matching, and so what they're really doing is they're showing this bond. And I also happen to like red as a choice. There are lots of colors that people use, but I like red as a choice because blood is red, and I think that's just kind of a fun symbolism there. Anyway, so what are the functions of these kin groups? Well, first of all, you get cooperative labor forces, and this is great when you're talking about hunting and gathering, but it's also going to extend to agriculture, construction of homes, barns, whatever, animal husbandry. It's also going to help you protect and maintain your resources from other groups, which brings us to the concept of self-defense in case some group wants to take your resources. And then also it provides you a force to take resources from some other group. Okay, so there are two big functions, right, when we're talking about the system. They're really, remember, kinships have, okay, so in this past slide, right, I have this functions of kin groups in terms of like jobs and stuff. But let's talk about functions in terms of social continuity, okay? The first one is the vertical function, and this is your descent or your lineage. This is where you are binding together successive generations, right? And so that would be this picture here. You're seeing a multi-generational group sitting around a table. And then horizontal function is going to provide that binding, right, of society across a single generation, and this is going to be through marriage, right? And marriage can ally similar groups or it can ally different groups, right? And I happen to like this picture because of that too. Now, when we talk about descent groups, when we talk about these lineages, a descent group is a socially recognized link between ancestors and descendants. It does not necessarily have to be consanguineous, right? Which is, again, you should say that just for fun. The descent groups, the idea of having this particular lineage, it gives you a shared identity and an affiliation with a group. So it gives you this strong sense of belonging. It gives you a group with which you can share resources and labor and trust that that's going to be a good thing. You can support each other economically, morally, emotionally, whatever, physically, right, in terms of maybe you have to fight off some other group, whatever. You also have this opportunity to build community through the participation in religious and civic activities. And civic activities include helping other groups, perhaps. You also have this descent of property, right? The inheriting of property, and oftentimes political office. I mean, if you start thinking about royalty, that is going to be a hereditary office. And so there's your descent group. Also regulates marriages, right? So sometimes we'll talk later on about marriages and stuff like that and how those have evolved over time. But ultimately, marriages used to be really about allying various lineages, descent groups. Okay, and then behavior, right? You have this group that now has rules for how you conduct yourself in a way that is productive for the group as a whole. So that's behavior control. Okay, so the Navajo, one of the New Mexico Native American tribes, the Navajo kinship system is similar to that of Scottish clans. Strictly governs the behavior of the clan, requires people to find marriage partners within the clan, or requires different clans in the same area to interact as a single community. So basically what I'm asking you is the kinship rules for the Navajo are, well, they're not actually that similar to Scottish clans. But, I mean, all clans have similarities, but that's not what we're going for there. The idea of having people marrying within a clan, not really the best idea, yeah, because you're talking about related people. And there's no reason for different clans actually to interact as a single community. They can interact with each other, but they're not a single clan. And so in this case, what we have is this strictly governed behavior. There are lots of other things that go in that system, but this happens to be one of them, and so behavior is a big deal. Yeah. Now, descent groups, which descent group you belong to is going to be dependent on what kind of a system that you have, right? And so there are three big kind of descent systems. There's unilineal, ambilineal, and bilateral. And unilineal are probably some of the things that are more traditional. This is going to be matrilineal or patrilineal, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But this is where your loyalties will lie. With what family do you to which family do you belong? Yeah. Okay, so lineages, first of all, the descent group is going to be made up of the consanguineal kin, right? These are blood-related individuals. They descend from some common ancestor. That common ancestor is called the apical ancestor. And marriage, oftentimes, will ally two lineages together, because you typically are not going to want to marry within the lineage. Although that does definitely happen within royal families, and these are all royal families, by the way. So the other thing that you see with lineages is you'll have exogamy, which is marriage outside your social or biological group, right? And that is that alliance of two lineages. The reason that this is important is because it maintains communication among groups. you have this exchange of information and goods, so it provides trade, it can strengthen whatever your position is, and it maintains genetic diversity. And biologically speaking, that will be the most important reason. By the way, this would be the royal family of the Dubai, which is the United Arab Emirates. Apparently there are several different royal lineages there, but this is the Dubai. These are the Malaysian royal family, and this is the British royal family. Okay, so in unilineal descent, right, you have your membership, and it is exclusively through either the male or female line, okay? It's typical in non-Western societies, and you have this idea of being assigned to a group at birth based on either your mother or your father, okay? And the matrilineal would be the mother. And in societies where you have matrilineal descent, it's not that women are in charge, right? When you're talking about that, you're talking about matriarchal versus patriarchal, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, not today. But matrilineal descent groups it's the idea that you are affiliated with your mother's family, okay? And these are typical in horticultural societies where women do the majority of the agricultural work. They're tending the gardens and things like that. All of the children, whether they're male or female, will belong to the mother's descent group. And females are considered socially significant in these societies. It doesn't mean, like I said, that they're necessarily in charge, but they do have a socially important role. The continuation of the society depends on this group. So in a patrilineal society, then the view is that the continuation of the line is dependent on the male, right? So here the continuation of the line is dependent on the female. Now, another really good example is Jewish families, right? It's through the mother. If your mother isn't Jewish, then you are not Jewish, right? And so all kinds of things like that. That is not necessarily a horticultural society, by the way. That would be an exception to that rule. Okay, so the example I want to give you are the White Mountain Apaches. And women in this Native American tribe, the Apaches, they farm, they fish, they gather wild plants, they do it all together. They have this very strong female community, and their mythologies actually are based on this idea of being matrilineal. All women in the tribe are descended from Changing Woman, who is this kind of universal mother goddess for them. And we'll talk about that kind of figure also in a different conversation. But here's your next question. What statement about the Zuni, also New Mexico, kinship system is true? So the Zuni kinship system has a bilateral system. Husbands divide their allegiances and time between the lineages of their wives and the lineages of their mothers. Women are the major figures in performing sacred lineage ceremonies, or they practice patrilocal residence. Patrilocal would mean living with the father's family. Well, in this case, they don't have any of these. Women are socially significant in the Zuni because they are a matrilineal society as well. But they have a little bit more complicated system. The male children, right, their lineage is through their mother, but then they also have to respect and participate in the lineage of their wives, which is through their mother. Yeah, and so it's a little bit more complex layering there. Okay, so let's talk about patrilineal descent groups. In this case, the males are the most socially significant. This is much more common than matrilineal systems. In this case, the authority is going to lie with the father, and typically it's the elder father, right? And so if you have multi-generation, it's going to be the older fathers until that time which the next generation takes over. But all children, male or female, belong to the father's descent group exclusively. And here's a nice example, or here's a good example. The Han, which is the dominant ethnic majority in China, almost all of the ancestral temples, which are also called clan houses, are dedicated to the male ancestors. You rarely see female ancestors. Okay? So if you're a member of a patrilineal descent group, descent is traced exclusively through females. Your sisters belong to the same patrilineal descent group that you do. You're likely to live in a horticultural society. Your brothers belong to the same descent group, but your sisters do not. You do not have a mother. Well, at some point, everyone's got a mother, so that's right out. If your descent is traced exclusively through females, then you are matrilineal, right? Horticulture, also matrilineal. You don't really have systems where siblings don't belong to the same descent group, so D is right out. But you and all of your siblings, sisters or brothers, will belong to your father's group. Okay, now bilateral descent. This is something that you see in contemporary societies. Children belong to the descent groups of both of their parents. And interestingly enough, you have some much more complicated descent groups as you start having different kinds of families, especially when you start talking about same-sex parents, because there isn't a matrilineal and patrilineal option, right? And so these are also going to be bilateral, and so it just kind of fits nicely into this more modern system of identifying with both families. Okay, so when we talk about just kinship in general, I thought this was interesting, and you can think about your own families. But if this is you, the decedent, you can see how everyone is related to you. So anyone who has your parents as their parents, obviously is your sibling. But then you can start seeing where aunts and uncles come in, which you already knew. But then you start talking about cousins, like what does removed mean? What's a second cousin? What's a third cousin? That sort of thing. Okay, now clans. We had descent groups, the lineages, okay? Clans are the same idea as having this apical ancestor, just like lineages. But that ancestor does not have to be blood related, and it doesn't even have to be an actual person, right? And you can also be united through exogamy, which was the marriage idea. And I put, also adoption, right? But I put these pictures in here because I think the Scottish are probably some of the most famous for their clans and identifying with their clans. As a matter of fact, these are wedding dresses, and so these women are showing their clan, right, through their plaid, and then of course these gentlemen are having a competition of strength, and their team is represented with their crest and their plaid. Okay. And clan affiliation, right, like I said, can be through actual lineage. It can be through marriage. The other thing that you typically find especially when you're talking about European clans, like Scottish clans and sometimes Irish, but mostly Scottish, you can have groups, and again, it's not exclusive, but this is a really good example. You'll find that in some clan situations, lots of names will be associated with a larger, more powerful clan. Those are called septs, by the way. Some of these are allied through marriage. Some of these occur through fission. That is because the group has gotten too large and has split and taken on some other familial name. Sometimes they're groups that live in another clan's land, and so there's a more powerful, they're called lairds in the case of Scottish clans, and so they'll ally with them even though they're not related, and then they will claim that same ancestry at some point. And that brings us to the idea of totemism, and this is the belief that people are related to particular animals or plants or natural objects, right? Oftentimes this belief extends to the idea that you descend from a common ancestor that is represented by that animal or the animal itself. And so clans around the world, whether you're talking about Native Americans, this is a Navajo totem, and these are the totem poles of the Pacific Northwest, are probably the things that come to mind when you think of totem, but it doesn't have to be one of these things. But clans will claim a uniting symbol. King Arthur, right? Pendragon, the dragon, right? That's their uniting symbol of that family. The bees of the Medicis, right? That's what okay, now I'm just rambling about that. But anyway, same idea. And so you'll have this uniting symbol, and everyone looks at that symbol as being special to them, okay? And typically, the apical ancestor it's going to be that animal. So in some Native American tribes, for instance, everyone is descended from the wolf or the bear or the eagle, okay? Sometimes it's a representation of an ancestor. That ancestor may be a real person, or it may in fact be a legend, right? A folklore or even a god, okay? And we'll talk about that more when we start talking about folklore and mythology. But mostly it's used as a means of identifying what tribe you belong to. This I just put in here so you can kind of see. We start out as foragers, and then we have this kind of like general trade society, and we are divided up into bands. Here's some examples of groups. Then we move into horticulture, and we'll talk about mode of production when we talk about agriculture and jobs, industries. This is going to be development and exchange. This is going to be where we start talking. This is what we're talking about now. Sorry. When we talk about religions, we'll talk about what these things mean: the communalistic cult versus the ecclesiastic cult, things like that. But basically, what we're discussing today is how you go from these bands, these small foraging groups, to the idea of these lineage groups, these descent groups, which become tribes, right? And then eventually you go to the state. And I put in here the levels of political organization. So you start with the bands, right? Tribes are made up of bands. Chiefdoms are made up of a collection of tribes. And sometimes you can think of chiefdoms as clans, actually. And then you have states, right? And so who leads these? This is just a fun fact for you. Elders. Bands and tribes don't really have centralized authority. They have elders in some groups, like the Malaysian big men, things like that. And then you have chiefdoms will have a centralized leader. You have some sort of hereditary chief. This is where you have that function of the descent group. And then states have a centralized government, and you may have a sort of, quote, ruling figure, and that figure may have more power or less power, depending on what you're actually talking about. But a state, and we'll pick this up later on when we start talking about development and exchange, and settlement, actually. But states are groups of people that are internationally recognized, right, as having these common cultures, common languages, but you have a distinct territory, right, and there is a body that exercises sovereignty over this group, right? And both of these things say the same thing, but we'll come back to this more later on. And of course, there is some representation. These basically are the symbols. In some cases, you actually have totems on your flags, things like that. There's one, right? Okay, so that is it for this conversation about kinship, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more as we go through. So if you have any questions, please let me know, and thanks for listening.